Welcome to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph D'Amicis, your host. Now, normally we talk about wine, tourism and the world of wine making up here in wine country. But today I want to talk about the importance of historical tourism. Wine country, Sonoma and Napa, in many ways are kind of like that person you meet who's really cute, and they're very upbeat and likable, and then they smell good, and you think, oh, they've had a really easy life. And then after you get to meet them, you know them for a while, and you find out that no, they have a whole past. They went through things, that they had to work hard, and they're smart, and they have connections to lots of other people. It's a much more complex person than you may immediately envision from when you met them. That's wine country in many ways. People come up here because it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It smells wonderful. We have great food. We have great wine. People have been coming up here for that reason for many years, and they sometimes miss the fact that the area has a remarkable history. See, Sonoma, and to a certain extent Napa, are as historically significant in California as Philadelphia, the birthplace of freedom, is to the entire United States. And for many years on my tours, I would tell people as we drove around the Sonoma Plaza that it was the Philadelphia of California, because it was here that California declared itself independent on June 14th, 1846. Now, it was only independent for a few weeks before it became part of the United States, but it was its separation from Mexico, which had previously been, Imperial Mexico, which was before that was Imperial Spain. So it had been under the Spanish thumb to a certain extent, admittedly the very, very far end of the Spanish thumb, for a long time. But it led the state behind it into becoming part of the United States. So we missed that. The Sonoma Plaza is the most historically significant spot in all of California. It is the home of the 21st and final mission, right? It was the home of the final presidio, or fort, and the home of the final pueblo, or official city, and, of course, the place for the Bear Flag Rebellion. It's kind of hard to beat that in California. In fact, you can't, because it's the only town that was all three. I think I've probably mentioned this before. It's a favorite topic of mine. I happen to love history. I grew up in New Jersey, which most people know because of the Jersey Shore, but it's also the site of more Revolutionary War battles than any other state. And as a child, we would visit them. We would go up onto the crest of the hills where Washington had his camp, where he could keep track of what they were doing in Manhattan in New York, which was a hotbed of spies. We visited Jockey Hollow, where they spent their winter in a year that was actually much worse than Valley Forge. It had a lot more snow. Valley Forge had a lot of rain, a lot of mud. So I love history. I've lived in Philadelphia. Gracie lived in New York City. But I love out here, I love Sonoma, I love Napa, because the history is more current. It's more personal in many ways. And we walk the streets where, General Vallejo walked, and Count Harasti walked, and the first settlers who came to Napa walk. We have dinner looking out at the river where the ships came in. Remember, the region developed because it was on a river. People could come up during the period of time of the steam launches in the 1800s. It was one of the things that made this area possible. And I think historical tourism is a very big draw in this area that we do not really take advantage of. The first person I met who did this seriously is another host here at the radio station, and someone I've worked with multiple times, George Weber. George and I have done multiple shows together, multiple TV shows. He played the role of the Count Harasti at the Buena Vista Winery for many years, traveled all over the country, talking to people in character. He's a great wealth of information, a great researcher about history. The other person who really got me interested in it is Shelley Smith. She was the director of the Napa Historical Society. Now, Shelley is actually a professor and a doctor of history and archaeology, specifically marine archaeology. She actually traveled the world with her fins for many years with her scuba gear. Remarkable person. And when she was retiring, she returned home to Napa, and she was convinced to become the head of the Historical Society on a very specific period of time for just several years. But a woman of just tremendous energy and brilliant and drive and a true understanding of how nonprofits need to work, and really created a stamp there that was very effective, but also got me very enthused about the potential for historical tourism in our area. And she did some wonderful things while she was there before she then retired a second time and the new director, Caitlin, came in. I think we need to look very carefully at how do we share this with others? How do we help other people recognize the historical significance of this region? San Francisco, up until the earthquake, was the largest city in California. At that time, down in LA was mostly farming and orange groves. Of course, today it's a huge metropolis. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. In terms of population, it's massive in terms of the Americas. Of course, it's probably smaller than Mexico City, but remember, most of the people on the planet actually live in Asia. There's actually a relatively small circle where more than half of the world's population live through Asia into India. India now is the most populous city. And yet we see so many people come here from China, from Asia, from India, from this most populated area to visit here. And they're always fascinated by our history. The Europeans too, they're always fascinated by our history. They're fascinated by our wine too, of course, but by our history. And you really think, why is that? They have so much history themselves, but it's what I mentioned before. It's more current. The mission was established in 1820. That's just over 200 years ago. In terms of history, that's a blip. In terms of archaeological history, it's a tiny, tiny speck. But in terms of our lifetime, that if you had a person who lived 100 years and they had a child and they lived 100 years, now admittedly having a child when you're 100, that shows a lot of vitality, I admit, but they could be in the same family. They could be the grandparent and the grandchild. They would span that entire period. I'm a boomer. I come from the boomer generation. And I was the youngest child of the youngest child. Okay. And so as a result, my grandfather on one side was born in 1865. Well, this is the years, very, very close to the American Civil War. And then I've traced my family back. I've traced them back easily into before the American Revolutionary War in just a couple of generations. This is why the history that we live around, the buildings that we live around that were built by, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, and were built by his brother Salvador, right there in the Sonoma Plaza. There's the Salvador's Pueblo, the home that the Donner sisters lived in over on Donner Street, the Pueblo there. There's all these beautiful Pueblos in the area that are really part of the living history of this area. And I really think that we need more people who portray this part. If you've traveled to a lot of historical areas, and Lonnie and I have, because we're professional speakers and we've been involved with many companies, and they've very nicely transported us on to beautiful places that were quite historic. Philadelphia is just one of them, but many different areas. Savannah, Georgia. I'm trying to think of other. We've been to so many different ones over the years. In China, and you go to the Great Wall, and wherever you go, there's always tour guides to tell you about the area. And it's funny, I remember years and years ago going on a carriage ride and where they were talking about the history of the area. And funny that I remembered so little of it. But with other tour guides, I remembered a great deal. And I realized the reason was the guide who told us stories gave us an arc. The person arrived, they did this, they did that, and they ended up over here. Like, for instance, the story of Dr. Bale, who was a physician from England, and his first job was as the ship's doctor on a British ship. And on his first voyage, they were shipwrecked off the coast of Monterey, and he was apparently one of the only survivors. He made it ashore, this young man, this physician, and he got a job as the official physician for the governor of California. Why? Because the former doctor of the governor had just tried to mount an insurrection against the governor. So he got fired. So he needed a new physician. And so he became the physician for the base of Monterey. He became the physician for San Francisco. He then married into the family. The governor was actually the nephew of Vallejo, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. And then he married, I believe, was one of the Vallejo's nieces, I believe, and then was given a large tract of land up in the Sonoma Valley, up in an area called Carne Humana, which meant human flesh for some reason. And became quite well to do, paid to have the bale of grist mill built, and then later from there, someplace along the way, even though he was now married and he had a young child, and his daughter was married off to Krug, and the Krug Winery's property was the dowry that she brought to the marriage. And then for some reason he decided this wasn't enough, so he went off to the gold rush country to search for gold and died out there. Now that's an amazing story arc of an adventurous and quite outrageous character. That kind of story you remember. That's what's so interesting here. We have wonderful stories, and I think we need more people who are willing to tell those stories and how they wove into the wine world, how they, wove into the wonderful agriculture here. Remember that at this point, only about 5% of America's population is involved in actually making food, growing food. It's a very small percentage. I mean, it used to be 80%. Now it's 5, 6, 7%. And we're part of that. Wine country is part of that. We admittedly produce a drink, but we produce a lot of other foods as well. And we produce a very popular drink. And the stories of how people came to be here, the stories of the adventures they went through, people remember. So many times I've had tour clients come back and they have told me about the particular stories that they remembered I had told them, that they had then recounted to other people, usually when pouring the wine they bought during the trip, which is a great time to pour wine and tell stories when you combine the two together. So I'm just kind of encouraging people to consider that when you're thinking about what direction you want to do in terms of your presentation in your wineries. What do you want to include? Give some context. This is not just a pretty face. This is not just a place that smells good. This is a place with wonderful history, with wonderful context. It's one of the reasons we wrote our tour books, our Wine Country in Shorts, and then later our favorite Napa stories, our favorite Sonoma stories, those books, because these were the stories I'd been telling over my shoulders to clients driving between wineries for, at that point, 17 or 18 years before I started writing them down. And they gave me context. They made the places I was going special. And I felt connected to them because I felt connected to the stories and to the people who went through those stories. We all go through things. We all have struggles. And when you hear the stories of someone who went through similar struggles that you could relate to and then overcame them, and we're successful, it empowers you. It makes you feel connected. It makes you feel, not alone. That you're not alone in the challenges you decide to take on. It encourages you, which the word encourage, it means to add courage. In life, courage is such an important factor. It's one of the things that leads us from kind of the lower vibrations to the upper vibrations, that we are courageous. So just something to think about here in wine country. So in the next segment of Wine Country at Work, we're going to talk with some folks about the possibilities of, historical tourism in the North Bay, and then hopefully give you something to think about. So remember, you can always visit us at winecountryatwork.com and come back after the break. I think it will be interesting.